Tonight we begin a slow, wide journey through the fields and kitchens of the medieval world. I want to show you why the food of the Middle Ages, the bread, the broth, the wild herbs, the cured meats and spiced pies, was among the best ever made. Not in a Michelin star way, no, but in a way that fed the body and soul, in fire-lit rooms where every bite was earned. The people who cooked back then knew hunger, knew rhythm, knew how to coax magic from simple things. And as we travel, I think you'll begin to feel it too. It starts with soil, with hands in the earth. Let's begin in a small village in what's now southern France, maybe around the year 1283. The fields are green with barley, and the women are kneeling in gardens where leeks, onions, cabbages, and turnips push their way up through the spring soil. The kitchen here isn't in the house, it's outside, or maybe under a wooden awning where smoke won't blacken the walls. The cooking is done low and slow. A single pot over a fire holds everything, a pottage thick and humble, changing slightly each day, depending on what is available. There are no potatoes yet, no tomatoes. But there are wild garlic leaves, salt from distant coasts, and sometimes, if the pigs have been slaughtered recently, a slice of salted belly or a bone for flavor. Food was not wasteful. It was worshipped. Nothing was thrown away that might feed. Bread was made with coarse flour, sometimes mixed with crushed beans or acorns in times of scarcity. You'd tear it, dip it, soak it in stew, eat it with calloused fingers beside the fire. You'd feel full, but also held. Let's walk north now, through woodland paths and deer trails into the cold damp of an English village near the borderlands. Here, the hearth is everything. It's the heart of the home, the warmest place, the cook's throne. In wealthier households, there might be an oven, an actual brick or clay structure for baking. But for most, it's the fire and the iron pot again. The seasons dictate the menu. In spring, young greens and nettles. In summer, berries and fresh herbs. In autumn, dried peas, root vegetables, and whatever meat has been smoked, salted, or pickled. In winter, winter is a test. Preserved foods reign here. Salted herring, hard cheese, cured sausages, black bread. Fermentation was survival. Cabbage becomes sauerkraut. Apples become cider. Milk becomes butter. Then buttermilk. Then hard cheese. They understood how to stretch time through taste. But food wasn't just about surviving. It was deeply social, symbolic, even sacred. In monasteries, the monks grew extensive herb gardens and kept strict dietary rules. Many went without meat entirely, relying on eggs, legumes, and fish. Their kitchens were places of silence, but also of innovation. Some developed early forms of custards and tarts, playing with eggs, cream, and honey. Now travel with me south again to Al-Andalus, where Islamic rule in medieval Spain created a cuisine unmatched in complexity. Almond milk, saffron rice, rosewater, cinnamon, preserved lemons, pomegranate sauces. These dishes shimmered with poetry. Recipes were written down. ingredients cataloged. Food was science, art, devotion, and it wasn't only for the elite. In cities like Cordoba or Granada, even modest homes might share in the flavors of distant empires. Step with me now through a medieval market. The smells hit you first. Grilled meats, spiced pastries, fresh herbs crushed beneath boots. Traders shout in half a dozen languages. Here, salt is gold, honey is currency. Spices, pepper, cumin, clove, nutmeg arrive in tiny packets, guarded like treasure. A goose plucked and dressed hangs from a hook. A boy slices a wheel of cheese, crusted in ash. A woman sells little cakes made from oats, butter, and honey. None of it is factory made. All of it is personal. Recipes are passed down by mouth, by memory, by feel. You taste what your grandmother tasted and what her grandmother tasted before her. And there is joy in it, a grounded joy, because food means more than fuel, it means belonging. And so, as you rest now, maybe with your eyes soft and heavy, imagine this: a loaf of bread baked in an open hearth, its crust dark and crackling. A stew of lentils and onions, simmered for hours with a splash of ale and a pinch of crushed fennel seed. A slice of apple, tart and wild, dipped in honey. A mug of warm mead beside a low fire. These were the comforts of a time when food took time, when hands did the work, when the table was a sacred thing. You're not just hearing history, you're tasting it piece by piece. And we've barely begun. Ahead lie feasts and famines, royal kitchens and forest camps, forgotten grains and legendary pies. But tonight, rest in the flickering warmth of a simpler world, where the best food in history wasn't found in a palace, but in the hands of those who made it with patience, purpose, and love. Now feel the cold stones underfoot as we enter the great kitchen of a high medieval manor. Not quiet, not at all. This place is alive with heat, motion, orders barked and repeated. The air is thick with rendered fat, the sharp tang of vinegar, the sweet drift of crushed berries boiling down to a glaze. Here, food is spectacle. The roasting hearth dominates the far wall where entire animals, boars, stags, geese, turn slowly on iron spits. Men in coarse tunics sweat beside the flames, basting with herbs tied into bundles of cloth, dipped in broth and vinegar. The spit boy turns the crank endlessly, sometimes with a song, often with a sigh. In the center of the room, pastries are being shaped by hand. Not just sweets, but savory wonders. Meat pies sealed with flour and lard, their crusts pinched like braids. These pies weren't just delicious, they were storage units. A hard shell kept food fresh, sealed it away from insects and air. Even in the noble houses, preservation was survival. And then, the feast. It is not just a meal, it is theater. Dishes arrive in waves, each stranger than the last. Swan, roasted and redressed in its own feathers. A peacock dyed blue with crushed berries. Eels arranged in spirals like dragons. And spice, so much spice. Ginger, saffron, mace, galangal. To be spiced was to be wealthy, educated, worldly. These flavors came from far beyond the mountains, carried on the backs of camels and across storm-tossed seas. The medieval palate prized contrast, sweet with savory, vinegar with honey, meat with fruit, lamb and cinnamon sauce, fish with raisins and wine. Some modern chefs might call it confused, but listen closer. These were people tasting the world with open mouths, eager to transform the ordinary into something sacred. And yet, even with all the opulence, these grand kitchens depended on simple things: salt, fire, patience, and hands that knew when a dough had rested enough, or a broth had whispered its final note. Let's step away from the lords now and into the monastery walls. The contrast is sharp, soothing. Here, silence holds the air like breath before prayer. The kitchen is disciplined. Meals are measured, humble, often meatless. But don't mistake it for bland. The monks were innovators. They kept bees for honey, brewed ale for nutrition, and grew herbs with medicinal purpose: sage, mint, lovage, rue. Their gardens were laboratories, and their food was both fuel and theology. They dried fruit in the sun, pickled beans in vinegar, pressed cheeses in wooden forms. In some monasteries, they made soft curd desserts from almond milk, thickened with rose water and rice flour, a kind of proto-pudding. The rule of Saint Benedict encouraged moderation, not misery. And so, within those stone walls, they achieved something rare: nourishment without excess. It is said that the monks of Cluny ate better than kings, not in quantity but in quality, balance, care. But what of the poorest? The peasants scraping a life from thin soil and heavy taxes. Their food, though plain, was honest. They foraged, they stretched, they reused everything. Soups were eternal. Pottage that never truly ended, just absorbed new ingredients each day. Bones were boiled until they gave up everything, then dried and cracked again for marrow. Nothing wasted. Bread was life. And when grain failed, hunger followed. In lean years, they ground dried peas, chestnuts, even tree bark into their loaves. Hunger was a companion, sometimes quiet, sometimes screaming. But even so, they gathered at table. They shared. A crust of bread and a smear of lard might be passed with reverence. And when they could, they feasted. Weddings, baptisms, harvests, these moments lit up the year like stars. On those days, they roasted chickens, poured cider, fried fritters in animal fat, and tossed them with herbs or ash sugar. For one day, they ate like kings. Let's not forget the seasons. Medieval people didn't eat strawberries in January or lamb in August. They followed the earth's pace. Spring was lean but hopeful. Greens, milk, eggs. Summer burst with color, berries, herbs, young vegetables. Autumn was a scramble, pickling, drying, smoking. Winter was dark, salted, sour, but warm. This rhythm created a cuisine that respected time, honored it. They celebrated it even. In England, Lammas Day in August marked the first wheat harvest. Loaves were baked and blessed. In Germany, the grape harvest led to new wine festivals. Every bite had a season, and every season its taste. There is wisdom in that. Wisdom we've forgotten. So now, as the stars drift above us again, and the air cools around your resting body, think of that world, not as primitive, but as deeply human. A world where food was shaped by landscape and belief, by ritual and resilience, where flavor came not just from ingredients, but from story, from struggle, from patience. We've wandered through castles and cloisters, through fields and feasts, but there is so much more still to taste. More smoke, more salt, more sweetness. So rest now, breathe deep. You're still with me. That's good. Now let's turn toward one of the quiet miracles of medieval life, preservation. Because to eat in winter meant thinking in summer. And so, the people of the Middle Ages became masters of making food last, not with machines or chemicals, but with salt, smoke, vinegar, and air. In almost every home from Scotland to Sicily, you would find preserved food in some form. Meat especially had to be saved. A pig slaughtered in November would feed a family for months. Its flesh salted, hung, smoked over alder or oak, its fat rendered and stored in crocks, its intestines cleaned for sausage, its bones saved for stock. Fish, too. Salted cod from the Atlantic was traded deep into the continent, hard and dry as stone, until it was soaked and revived. Herring was packed in barrels by the thousands, swimming in brine. This wasn't luxury. This was life insurance. Then there was fermentation, that old alchemy. Before refrigeration, it was the safest way to store the harvest. And it made things taste alive. Cabbage became sauerkraut. Its sharpness a burst of sunlight in the deep winter months. Milk turned to cheese, evolving from soft and fresh to aged and firm, kissed by cave air and time. Grains soaked and soured became the base for black breads and porridges rich with dark, tangy depth. Ale bubbled in wooden vats, not just a drink, but nutrition, thicker and cloudier than modern beer, full of calories and culture. Even fruit was transformed, apples into cider, grapes into vinegar, plums into dense, sticky preserves. These weren't just stopgaps. They were flavors in their own right. Medieval palates were far more complex than we often imagine, sour, bitter, funky, earthy. These were people who expected food to speak with multiple voices. And then, fasting. Because to understand medieval food, you must understand how often they chose not to eat, or at least not to eat in the usual way. The church's calendar was thick with fasting days, nearly half the year. No meat, no dairy, no eggs. This created an entire alternate cuisine, especially in the cities and monasteries. Almond milk replaced cow's milk. Fish replaced beef. Dishes became clever. Fish pies disguised as birds. Mock cheeses made from ground nuts. The fasts weren't just religious, they trained cooks to be inventive. And they reminded people that food was more than fuel. It was a moral choice, a daily devotion, a way to honor the divine. Yet even here, there was richness. Spices were still used. Sauces were still layered. A fasting dish could be every bit as grand as a feast, just crafted with constraint. But food wasn't sealed off within borders. It traveled, carried by traders, pilgrims, warriors, and exiles. When the Crusaders returned from the Holy Land, they brought more than wounds. They brought almonds, citrus, cinnamon, rice. Not in bulk, not at first, but as treasure, as stories. Over time, these ingredients found homes in European kitchens. Moorish Spain became a cradle of culinary exchange. There, Christian, Muslim, and Jewish cooks lived side by side, each influencing the other's kitchens. Honeyed pastries with rosewater, spiced stews with dried fruit, thin noodles boiled and served with cream. This was not a frozen era. It pulsed with trade, with argument, with adoption. In Sicily, Arab irrigation techniques made lemon groves bloom. In Venice, spices flowed in from Alexandria. The medieval table was global, long before anyone called it that. Let's slow down now and wander into the cookbooks. Yes, there were cookbooks, not many, and not for common hands. But they exist. Written in Latin, in Anglo-Norman French, in Middle High German. The form of curie, penned by the master cooks of King Richard II, holds dozens of recipes. Some detailed, some vague, all poetic. Take good beef, and hew it small, and do thereto good broth, and sweet cow's milk, and boil it with herbs. It wasn't precise, it didn't need to be. These books weren't for beginners, they were memory aids, triggers for trained minds. But even in their imprecision, they reveal so much. A love of balance, a craving for texture, a preference for colors even, dishes dyed with herbs or saffron to make them golden, bright, appetizing. Eating was a feast of the senses, a moment to impress, to elevate. And now, as you lay in stillness, think of this: a pot sealed with dough, its contents bubbling beneath. A line of cheese wheels aging in a stone cellar. A jar of pickled onions, sharp and perfect, waiting for winter. A loaf of rye bread, its crust hard and bitter, its center dense and dark with memory. A monk's spoonful of lentils, a night's bite of sweetmeat. A farmer's sip of sour cider at dusk. It was never just about food. It was about time, about survival, about faith, about touch. And so as you rest here, warm and quiet, know that every bite they took carried a story. And we're only beginning to taste it. Let us begin where joy is loudest, at the feast. Imagine a small village square in spring, the first warm day after a long frost. The planting is done, the daylight is stretching longer, and tonight the whole village gathers. There is music, yes, and dancing, but the heart of it is food. Every household contributes: roasted chickens seasoned with parsley and sage, loaves of dark bread, fresh goat cheese pressed just days before. Someone brings a cake made from barley flour, honey, and dried crab apples. Another sets down a crock of thick ale, brewed strong and dark. Children dart between benches. Elders sit in the sun and tear bread with slow, sure hands. Feasting wasn't just celebration, it was community. A reminder that survival wasn't solitary. The food might not be elegant, but it was shared, and that made it sacred. But not every season brought feasts. Some brought silence. Famine haunted the Middle Ages like a distant drumbeat, always there, never quite gone. A poor harvest, a wet summer, a long winter. And suddenly, the village storehouse echoed with emptiness. Grain prices would soar. The poorest would mix sawdust or crushed bark into their bread. They would boil nettles and weeds, chew on dried roots. In some cases, people ate the seed grain meant for the next season, trading tomorrow for today. Hunger was sharp, but it also forged ingenuity. The dishes that survived, simple, filling, adaptable, were born in these hard years. Thick porridges of oats or millet, soups made from whatever could be gathered or stretched. Food preservation was not just a skill, but a defense against death. Every root cellar, every smoked ham, every dried bean was a shield. Even in better times, food was shaped by fear and faith. The line between nourishment and danger felt thinner then. Illness could strike from spoiled meat, from bad water, from imbalance. So people turned to the unseen. A stew might be stirred 3 times clockwise to bless it. Bread might be marked with a knife before baking to ward off evil. Certain herbs, like fennel, rue, and St. John's wort, were not just flavor, but protection. Garlic hung above doorways for more than just its taste. It was believed to repel illness, even demons. These weren't silly superstitions. They were coping tools. The world was unpredictable, so people made meaning from it. And the kitchen, filled with fire and metal and scent, became a place of both science and spirit. Seasonal food customs often had roots in older beliefs, woven into the Christian calendar. Pancake Day, before Lent, used up the eggs and fats that would be forbidden. Harvest feasts carried the memory of pagan rituals, honoring the earth, the sun, the grain spirits. Food marked time. Bread was broken at baptisms. Spiced cakes were served at weddings. Certain fish were eaten on saints' days. Even the poor knew these rhythms. A pottage eaten on a fasting Friday tasted different than the same dish on a Monday. It was touched by context, by meaning. Food had roles to play. not just to feed, but to bless, to bind, to remember. Now let's touch briefly on hospitality, because how you fed a stranger said everything about you. In noble houses, guests were offered the best cuts of meat, the freshest loaves, and sweetmeats as a sign of status. But even in peasant cottages, a stranger would be offered what little there was: a bowl of soup, a heel of bread, a cup of thin ale. To turn someone away was dangerous. You never knew when you might be the one knocking next. In inns, meals were communal, benches, not tables, and shared trenchers of stew or meat. People used their fingers or their knives. The idea of personal plates was foreign. Eating was not private. It was social, public, performed. Every meal was a negotiation of space, of respect, of safety. And so, as you drift again into stillness, imagine the candlelight flickering across a crowded table. Imagine the noise: cutlery scraping wood, laughter, the quiet clink of ale mugs. Now picture the silence that followed a bad harvest, the hush as someone passed a shared bowl to a child before taking their own share. Picture the fast days, the feast days, the days when food was story. These aren't fairy tales. They were real, and the food, simple, rough, slow, sacred, carried all of it: memory, magic, mercy. And we're not done yet. We still have marketplaces to visit, breads to bake, forbidden fruits to taste. So rest now. Let the world go quiet. Let your mind drift now into a medieval marketplace, the kind that springs to life before the sun has fully shaken off the mist. The stalls are rough-wooded, covered in patched linen, or open to the sky, and every sense is pulled in a different direction. The scent of salted fish, the warmth of fresh bread, the tang of sour cider sloshing in clay jugs. Traders shout in the dialects of nearby valleys, their words thick with accent and urgency. Here, food isn't wrapped in plastic or priced by barcode. It's felt, sniffed, argued over. A turnip still covered in damp soil. A string of garlic bulbs tied with straw. An egg passed from hand to hand, still warm from the hen. Nothing here is anonymous. Everything has a story. Markets were lifelines. Not every village had one of its own. Many people walked miles to reach one, carrying eggs, cheese, or woven baskets to trade. There were no supermarkets, no global supply chains. What you saw at market was what was in season, what had survived the journey, what hadn't spoiled. The luxury of choice didn't exist, but there was still beauty in the limitations. Honey instead of sugar, chickpeas instead of meat, apples instead of oranges. The local became beloved. Certain towns were famous for certain things: an herb grown in the monastery garden, a cheese aged in mountain caves, a grain that flourished in rocky soil where nothing else would grow. Food wasn't separate from land. It was the land. The way people bought food was different too. Most purchases were small. A few onions, a wedge of cheese, a handful of dried peas. There was no cold storage at home, no pantries lined with tin cans. Food was bought often and used quickly. Waste was rare because it couldn't be afforded. Scraps were reused, bones boiled, yesterday's bread fried or soaked in broth. Even the water used to rinse vegetables might be fed to pigs. Preservation wasn't just a method, it was a mindset. And though these markets were often humble, they could surprise you. A merchant newly returned from Venice might offer cinnamon sticks. A trader from the coast might sell anchovies packed in oil. Spices came in tiny packets, wrapped like treasure. Few could afford them, but their scent, sharp, mysterious, lingered on the air, a promise of something more. Different regions meant different diets. In the north, meals leaned heavy: barley, oats, salted pork, cabbage, and hearty root vegetables. Ale was thick, bread was dark, and butter ruled where oil was rare. In the south, especially in places touched by Arabic and Mediterranean influence, food changed. Olive oil instead of lard. Almond milk, not cream. Lemons, oranges, rice, chickpeas. Bread might be white, fine sifted, almost cake-like. Herbs like coriander and mint-flavored meats. Sauces had tang, vinegar, citrus, wine reductions. Even the heat of the sun shaped the diet. In warm places, food had to last, cool, hydrate. In cold lands, it had to stick to the bones, warm the blood, survive the dark months. These weren't choices. They were necessities. And through it all, the slow rise of towns and cities began to change how food moved. Guilds formed, bakers, butchers, brewers, each with strict rules and apprenticeships. Bread had to be a certain weight, sold at a fair price, or the baker risked punishment. In some cities, baking bread in the home was banned, too dangerous. Instead, people made dough at home and brought it to communal ovens, where the fire was kept hot by a designated baker. Urban food meant shared resources, new constraints. Meat markets had to be kept away from fresh water. Food waste was carefully managed. Even street food began to emerge. Meat pies sold from carts, hot drinks brewed with spices and sweetened with honey. In a world without fast food, this was the closest thing to convenience, but always, flavor was married to effort. So now, as you drift again into stillness, picture the market stall at the edge of a village square. A wheel of cheese crusted in ash. A pot of beans simmering behind a trader's booth. A child biting into a tart apple, juice running down their chin, nothing polished, nothing processed. Everything direct, everything personal. This was food you could feel, taste that belonged to a place. Effort that was visible in every loaf, every stew. And we've only just begun to taste the range of this world. Still ahead are breads that rose with beer foam, ale brewed from nettles and honey, pies with living birds inside. So sleep now. Let your dreams take you down quiet, cobbled roads, past clay ovens and garden paths. Let's step now into a medieval kitchen, not the sprawling royal kind, but the sort found in a modest stone house at the edge of a village. There's no chimney, not yet. Smoke clings low to the ceiling, curling out through cracks and vents in the thatch. The hearth is always burning, or nearly so. It is the engine of the home, the guardian of warmth, light, and sustenance. Most of the cooking happens low and slow. Iron pots hang from hooks over open flame, or rest on stones beside glowing embers. Bread bakes in the coals, wrapped in leaves or sealed in covered pans buried in ash. There are no stoves, no timers. Cooking is done by touch, by sound, by experience. A woman knows her soup is done by the way the spoon moves through it. A man judges bread by the smell of its crust, not a clock. These are skills passed through generations, not taught in books. The tools are simple but clever. Mortars for grinding herbs. Wooden spoons worn smooth from years of stirring. Clay pots lined with glaze, some chipped but still precious. Skimmers woven from twigs. A board for chopping. A hook for meat. No stainless steel, no factory molded pans. Everything is shaped by hand and repaired and passed on. Even the knives are personal, often carried on the belt, valued as much for their sharpness as for the stories they hold. There is no such thing as non-stick. Pans are seasoned with fat and use. Fire is adjusted with ash and patience, not a dial. And yet meals still appear, daily, warm, sustaining. Every dish is a small triumph over the uncertainty of life. Bread, especially, is more than food. It is ritual. It begins with grain, ground slowly in hand mills or, for the fortunate, brought to the village miller. The flour is coarse, speckled, alive. Leavening is often saved from a previous batch, a living starter that bubbles and ferments like a secret breath. Salt is precious and added carefully. The dough is mixed not in metal bowls, but in troughs or wooden pans, kneaded by hand, often communally. In cities where fire risk is great, people bring their risen dough to the communal oven. A mark, carved, scratched, or inked, tells whose loaf is whose. The scent of baking bread is constant in these towns, a signal of life moving forward day by day. And when the bread comes out, dense, dark, crusty, it is shared. With family, with neighbors, with strangers. And what of sweet things? They were rare, yes, but not absent. Honey was the great sweetener of the early medieval world, gathered by patient hands from wild hives, or kept in small wicker skeps. Cakes were made with grain, fat, eggs when allowed, dried fruits if lucky. In wealthier homes or monasteries, candied fruits appeared, orange peel boiled in syrup, nuts rolled in sugar, wine cooked down to syrup, spice cakes, laced with ginger or anise, were prized. Even the poor might sweeten their porridge with a spoonful of berry mash or roasted apple. Sweetness wasn't every day, it was occasion. It meant celebration. It meant effort. It was joy folded into flour. And mealtime? It was rarely solitary. In a household, food was shared from communal bowls, eaten with fingers, scooped with bread, or cut with a single shared knife. There were no courses. Everything arrived as it could. People sat on benches or stools, not chairs. There were no forks. Spoons were wooden, cups were shared, and a trencher, a slab of stale bread or carved wood, held the meal. The idea of etiquette was present but simple. Don't take more than your share. Don't spill. Give thanks. In noble houses, table manners became complex. How to carve, how to present, how to behave. But at its heart, even the grandest feast echoed the same truth as the humblest bowl. Food meant connection. So as you drift again into that quiet place between waking and sleep, imagine this kitchen. The warmth of the hearth, the soft creak of wood, the smell of barley bubbling, the scratch of a spoon on a clay pot, someone humming softly as they stir, not for show, not for praise, but because it brings them calm. Meals here were slow, yes, but not backward. They were full of care, of craft, of quiet ritual. And we're not done exploring. Still ahead are tales of ale and wine, the secrets of pies and puddings, the ways food marked status and identity. But for now, sleep easy. Let your thoughts settle in the scent of smoke and dough. Let us begin with ale, the drink of the people. Not quite beer as we know it. Ale was everywhere, thicker, cloudier, more nourishing. It was drunk by men, women, and children alike because water wasn't always safe, and ale, properly brewed, was. Made from malted grain, water, and sometimes herbs or sweeteners, it was a food as much as a drink. Brewing began in the home. The alewife, often a woman, would soak the grains, dry them, mash them, strain them, and boil them with herbs. The yeast came not from packets, but from the air, or from wooden tools that carried living cultures. It was a dance between patience and weather, between guesswork and ritual. The result? A drink that filled the belly, warmed the limbs, and dulled the hunger when food ran low. In wealthier or urban areas, alehouses emerged. Some run by women, others by licensed brewers. There were no taps or kegs, just barrels, mugs, and benches. People gathered here not only to drink, but to talk, sing, rest. Alehouses were the medieval version of social media. Rumor mills, job boards, matchmaking corners, and therapy couches. And not all ale was equal. Some was weak, meant for daily drinking. Others were strong, heady, brewed for feasts or festivals. Some were sweetened with honey. Others spiced with herbs like yarrow, heather, or bog myrtle before hops became widespread. Each region had its own brew, its own traditions, its own secret ways. Now let's taste wine, but tread softly. In much of medieval Europe, wine was the drink of the church and the elite. It was rarer in the north, where grapes struggled. But in the south, in France, Italy, Spain, it flowed more freely. Still, it was not the clear, refined liquid we think of today. It was rougher, sometimes sour, often diluted with water. It might be spiced, warmed, sweetened with sugar or honey. Monasteries became famous for their vineyards. Monks tracked the seasons, the slopes, the soil. Wine became theology, a symbol of the blood, the sacred, the eternal. It was stored in wooden barrels, carried in leather flasks, poured from clay jugs. In noble halls, it might be served mulled, heated with cinnamon, clove, pepper, ginger. A drink meant not just to refresh, but to dazzle. There were other drinks too, less famous but no less loved. Cider, especially in apple-rich regions, was common. Sometimes sharp, sometimes sweet. It fermented quickly and became a favorite where grapes did not grow. Perry, made from pears, was similar, gentler. Mead, fermented honey water, was older still, a drink of the ancient North, often reserved for celebrations, weddings, holy days. It was rich, heavy, golden. Herbal brews existed as well, not intoxicating but healing. Infusions of mint, sage, chamomile, nettle, brewed not just for taste, but for health, for clarity, for ritual. Each sip carried more than flavor, it carried meaning. Drinking was deeply social. At feasts, cups were passed hand to hand. Toasts were common. Wassail, the old word, meant be well. And the reply, drink hail, echoed the wish. There were customs about who drank first, how much, when to offer, when to accept. It was considered impolite not to raise a mug in return. In some cases, people drank from the same vessel, a symbol of unity. In others, ornate goblets were used to show status, decorated with metal, jewels, or family crests. The act of drinking wasn't just refreshment, it was performance, it was connection. And so, as the flicker of firelight fades to soft embers in your mind, imagine this: a wooden bench, a cool mug in hand, the scent of malt and smoke. Someone nearby sings a low, familiar tune. Someone else laughs. You're not alone. You're part of something older. Ale brewed from your own barley. Wine pressed by calloused hands. Honey gathered from a field where wild thyme grows. The drinks of the Middle Ages weren't fast, weren't sterile, weren't disposable. They were crafted, shared, remembered. And there's more ahead. Puddings stirred in stone bowls. Spices traded across continents. Kitchens where flavors became power. But for now, rest here. Let the warmth of the mug settle in your chest. Let's begin with the idea of sweetness. Because in the Middle Ages, sweetness was not an everyday affair. It was a signal of wealth, of joy, of something special. For most people, sweet things came rarely. There was no refined sugar on the shelf, no artificial sweeteners. The most common form was honey, gathered from wild hives or kept in straw skeps, tended carefully at the edge of fields. Bees were sacred, their hives blessed and whispered to. A single pot of honey might sweeten an entire season's worth of dishes. It was used in stews, glazes, drinks, and breads. But when sugar did appear, imported through long, risky trade routes, it was more than flavor, it was status. Sugar arrived in hard cones, wrapped tight, often locked away. To use it, you needed a tool to scrape it down, a kind of grater or hammer. It was not spooned out casually. It was weighed, measured, respected. When used, it transformed dishes. It glazed nuts, preserved fruit, sweetened wines. In the noble kitchens of France, England, or Italy, cooks began to explore sugar as an art. Jellies made with clarified fruit juice and set with fish gelatin. Marzipan shaped into flowers or birds. Candied peels boiled again and again until they sparkled like glass. These weren't daily treats. These were edible jewels, served in the final course of a feast as a kind of soft, shimmering farewell. But sweetness didn't always mean sugar. In the northern countryside, comfort often came in the form of puddings. Not the creamy desserts we think of now, but earlier, heartier things. Oatmeal boiled until thick, then flavored with dried fruit, nuts, or a spoon of honey. Barley cooked down with milk or almond milk, stirred until smooth, then flavored with herbs like mint or sage. Puddings were warm, filling, and adaptable. They could be sweet or savory. In poorer homes, they stretched what little grain and fat remained. In wealthier kitchens, they were enriched with cream, spices, even saffron. One early English recipe speaks of white pudding, made with rice, almond milk, sugar, and chicken, boiled until soft. Strange to us, maybe, but rich with medieval logic, texture, nourishment, balance. Pastries were another kind of joy. The dough was not delicate. It was dense, often made with lard or suet. Pastries were not always eaten for their crust. Sometimes the crust was just a cooking vessel, meant to hold fillings and be discarded. But in time, cooks began to craft edible crusts, flaky, flavored, hand-shaped, fruit tarts made with sour cherries, apples, pears. Sometimes, the fruit was cooked with wine and spices before being placed in the shell. Sometimes it was left raw to bake gently in the oven's warmth. In towns with access to exotic ingredients, you might taste fig or date pastries, sweetened with honey and perfumed with rosewater. These tarts were labor, every element hand-cut, hand-folded, baked in ovens whose temperature was guessed by instinct, not gauge. Spices played a deep role here, too. In modern kitchens, sweetness is often vanilla or chocolate. But in the Middle Ages, sweetness was colored by spice. Cinnamon, ginger, galangal, cloves. These were mixed into dough, stewed into syrups, ground into creams. Even pepper appeared in some desserts. The balance was key, not overwhelming, but layered, warming, surprising. When people ate these spiced sweets, they tasted distance, adventure, risk. They tasted the Silk Road, the spice ships, the risk of storms, the hands that packed and carried and sold. Every bite was a miracle of geography. And so, as the candle burns low beside your resting place, imagine this: a tray of spiced apple tarts, still warm from a wood-fired oven, a bowl of barley pudding, flavored with honey and dried currants, a mug of warm milk steeped with cinnamon and nutmeg, a spoon tapping the edge of a ceramic bowl. These were the quiet indulgences of the Middle Ages. They weren't mass-produced. They weren't cheap. They were made slowly, by hands that knew when a crust was done, when a syrup had thickened, when a pudding had set. And there's still more to taste, still more stories resting in the corners of forgotten cookbooks, in the ashes of hearths. But for now, let yourself sink into sleep, warmed by the memory of sweetness that once took days to create. Let us begin in winter, because that's where hunger lived closest. The fields are bare, the ground is frozen, the days are short, the air sharp, nothing grows. Everything eaten now must have been prepared before the frost, smoked, salted, dried, stored. Root vegetables sleep in cellars, turnips, carrots, parsnips. Onions hang in braids from beams. Cabbages, picked in the last breath of autumn, are salted into kraut. Meat, if there is any, is preserved. Ham, bacon, sausages hung in chimney smoke. Grains are ground and stored, but used carefully. Milk is rare, eggs are fewer. This is the lean time. Stews stretch long, ale is drunk warm. Honey, if there's any left, is saved for illness. And yet, there's comfort. A warm bowl by the fire, bread with cheese hard as stone but sharp with age. A cup of broth. In winter, food becomes memory. Then spring arrives, not with a feast, but a whisper. The first green shoots of wild garlic, nettles rising through frost-softened earth. Leeks planted last year pushing back to life. Milk returns. Eggs multiply. Herbs like sorrel, mint, and chervil reappear. The food is lighter, sharper. Soups turn green. Fresh cheese appears again. Fish plays a larger role, especially during Lent, when meat is forbidden. People crave freshness. After the staleness of winter stores, the peppery bite of cress is a miracle. The cook's hand grows gentler, the fire cooler. Everything is renewal. Even celebrations, like Easter, mirror this shift. The table brightens. The heart does too. Summer is abundance. The land is generous, but the work is endless. Wheat ripens, berries darken on the vine, gardens overflow. Meals become colorful. Salads of herbs and flowers, stews thickened with fresh peas, grilled meats, roasted roots, fruit tarts, warm from the oven, filled with cherries or gooseberries. Honey gathered again, ale brewed fresh. Preserving begins already. drying herbs, smoking early meat, making vinegar, pickling early vegetables. Food is faster now, eaten closer to harvest, less need for preservation. But the cook is busiest. Flies buzz, heat builds. The hearth must still burn, even in sweat. Yet this is when meals feel full, joyful. There is enough. Then autumn, the time of rush, of storing, of gathering in. Apples fall, grapes are pressed, pumpkins, squashes, late beans, rye, barley. Everything must be dealt with. Cider is brewed, wines ferment. The last of the animals are slaughtered. Only the breeding stock kept alive for winter. Blood pudding is made from what cannot be kept. Sausages are cured. Hams smoked. Beans dried. This is the real new year in the medieval world. What is done now decides whether the winter will be gentle or cruel. Yet feasts abound. Harvest festivals. Saint days. The kitchen becomes a stage of fire and knife and endless motion. And through it all, the fire never dies. Religious seasons, too, layered over the natural ones. Lent before Easter, Advent before Christmas. Feast days scattered like bright coins across the months. Fasting and feasting gave structure, purpose. A meatless Friday might mean eel pie. A feast day might mean roasted goose stuffed with apples and herbs. Christmas was not one day, but 12, each with its own rhythm, its own table. Epiphany brought cakes with hidden charms. Michaelmas in late September was goose and apples. Food carried the calendar, not just what you ate, but when and why. And so now, let your body soften with the rhythm of the year. Picture the smoke of a winter hearth, the green first bite of spring herbs, the sweet juice of a summer berry staining your fingers, the sharp snap of an autumn apple in cool air. The medieval table moved with the world, not against it. It listened to the earth, to the sun, to the belly. Food wasn't frozen, flown in, shipped out. It was grown, gathered, given. There is wisdom there, still more to taste. But for now, let this seasonal rhythm settle into your bones. Sleep easy. Let us begin where bread begins, in the fields. Wheat, rye, barley, oats. These were the foundation grains of medieval life, but they didn't grow everywhere equally. Wheat preferred warmer, drier climates. Rye thrived in colder, poorer soils. Barley grew quickly but had less gluten. Oats, often seen as animal feed, were used where nothing else would take root. The type of bread you ate depended on where you lived and how much you had. In the cities of southern France, white wheat loaves were common, soft, fine, refined. In the rougher lands of northern Europe, bread was dark, dense, and coarse, made from rye or barley, sometimes mixed with beans, acorns, or even moss in the leanest years. After harvest, the grain was threshed, winnowed, and milled. In some villages, women used hand querns, slow, back-breaking labor. But most grain was brought to the Lord's mill, powered by water or wind. The miller took a share, part payment, part tax. This flour was not pure white, not like the bags we know today. It was speckled with bran, with husk, with flecks of grit from the millstone. But it was enough. Enough to make dough. Enough to feed a family. Enough to turn into bread, the food of the body and the soul. The flour was mixed with water, salt, and a rising agent. Maybe a bit of old dough. Maybe ale barm. Maybe just the natural yeast in the air. It was mixed in large troughs, kneaded by hand, left to rise by the hearth. In towns and cities, baking was often done in communal ovens. People shaped their loaves at home, marked them with symbols or slashes, and brought them to the bakehouse. There, a fire had been burning for hours, heating the stones. Once the coals were swept out, the loaves were slid in, baked on the retained heat. It took skill to judge the temperature. No thermometer, just experience. The smell of bread filled the streets, and people waited, chatting, sharing news. For the rich, bread might be pure white, sifted through fine cloth, soft as cake. For the poor, it might be mixed with husks, hard as wood but still vital. Bread was eaten at every meal, dipped in broth, used as a spoon, sopped in gravy, or simply torn and chewed. In noble houses, trenchers were used, flat, stale loaves of bread that acted as plates. After the meal, they might be eaten, fed to the poor, or given to animals. Bread could show status. The whiter, the finer, the higher your place. But it also carried deep religious meaning. The Lord's Prayer says, "Give us this day our daily bread," for a reason. Bread was life. Communion was bread. To break bread was to make peace. To hoard it was a sin. In times of famine, people rioted over it. In times of plenty, they celebrated it. Festivals marked the first loaf of harvest. Loaves were blessed in churches. There were even charms baked into them. A ring, a coin, a bean. Whoever found it, it was said, would be lucky or pay for the feast. But bread could also betray. In years when grain was bad, or mills were corrupt, or ovens cold, people suffered. Bread adulterated with chalk or sand caused illness. Moldy grain could bring disease. In the worst years, when war or weather destroyed crops, people made bread from desperation. Tree bark, dried nettles, mashed roots. These were not metaphors. These were survival tactics. And still, the form held. The ritual remained. You broke the loaf. You shared it. You gave thanks for it. Even a small crust had power. It was never just food. It was the line between hunger and hope. So now, rest with this picture in your mind. A round loaf on a wooden board. Its crust dark, its center warm. A knife beside it. A small bowl of salt, a bit of soft cheese. A fire glowing low in the background. You tear the bread slowly. You chew. The taste is simple, yes, but deep. Alive. made from grain grown by hand, milled by stone, kneaded by calloused palms. It took time. It took earth and fire and care. This is the food that shaped 1,000 years. And there is more still to taste, more foods forgotten, more meals remembered. But for now, sleep easy. Let the warmth of the hearth settle around you. Let us begin in a noble hall, high-ceilinged and echoing with anticipation. The tables are long, the benches full. Guests are dressed in their finest, linen, fur, wool dyed deep red or blue. A feast is about to begin, not just a meal. A spectacle. Feasting was a performance of wealth and hospitality. It marked victories, weddings, visits from important guests, religious holy days, and the turning of the year. The food had to impress not only in flavor, but in form. Whole animals roasted and redressed. Towering jellies shaped like castles. Dishes dyed gold with saffron, red with sandalwood, green with parsley and sage. A cook might present a pie filled with birds, real, live birds that flew out when the crust was cut, not practical, not efficient, but unforgettable. Courses came in waves, each designed to surprise. The first might be small: spiced wine, a sweet meatball, a slice of cheese. Then came roasts: beef, lamb, game birds, or boar, flavored with herbs and vinegar, often paired with fruit sauces. Fish, served whole, glistening. Stews rich with marrow and spice. Salads of bitter herbs dressed with oil and verjuice. Then the subtleties: sweet, spiced confections, symbolic in shape and form, marzipan molded into flowers, sugar sculptures that echoed religious icons or mythical beasts. Everything was accompanied by ale, wine, mead, cider. And all the while, music, jugglers, minstrels. Feasting was never silent. It was a play, and food was the leading actor. But celebration wasn't only for the rich. In villages, festivals marked the agricultural calendar. The first plow, the final harvest, the midsummer fire, the winter solstice. At these gatherings, food was communal, hearty, and homemade. Pies filled with rabbit or chicken, stews thick with whatever was at hand, breads baked in great batches, cider passed in mugs, cakes flavored with herbs and honey, wrapped in cloth and carried from house to house. Children sang. Adults danced. The village square became a kitchen, a dining hall, a dance floor. These were the moments people waited for, saved for, worked for. In a hard life, feast days were anchors. They said, "You made it. You endured. Let's eat." Each major feast day had its own customs, often rooted in older pre-Christian traditions. At Christmas, a boar's head might be paraded into the hall, wreathed in rosemary, a symbol of plenty. At Easter, lamb and eggs stood for renewal. On All Souls' Day, soul cakes were baked and given to children, who sang at doorways in exchange for prayers for the dead. At Candlemas, pancakes were fried in animal fat, using up the last of the luxuries before Lent. And Lent itself changed the table entirely. No meat, no dairy, no eggs. But still, food was crafted with care. Fish pies, almond milk stews, breads flavored with herbs. Constraint birthed creativity. Even fasting had a flavor. Food during festivals carried layers of meaning. Certain spices hinted at luxury and trade. Certain dishes carried symbolism. The roundness of a loaf for the sun, the cross on a bun for the holy. Eating together wasn't just about nourishment. It was bonding, sharing, honoring, forgiving. Many festivals included rituals of hospitality, inviting the poor to eat, feeding travelers, offering food at church steps. To eat and not share was shameful. To feast without gratitude was dangerous. Food remembered those who were not at the table. And sometimes a space was set just for them. A plate, a mug, a candle. So now, close your eyes and imagine the warm chaos of a medieval feast. The clatter of wooden bowls, the scent of roasted meat and fresh herbs. A pie steaming in the cold air. A jug passed hand to hand, laughter rising, voices singing in rounds, the fire crackling. These were moments where food reached beyond need, where it became memory, music, ritual. There's still more to see, famine and faith, the silent wisdom of the forest, the herbs that healed. But tonight, rest in this joy. Let your dreams carry the music of feast day bells. Scarcity defined more meals than abundance. For all the lavish banquets and seasonal bounty, most of the medieval population lived one poor harvest away from hunger. Famine wasn't rare, it was expected. A cold spring, a wet summer, a local war, a mold in the grain. Any of these could erase a village's food supply. In those times, ingenuity became survival. Grains meant for planting were ground into emergency bread. Wild greens and weeds, sorrel, nettles, chickweed, were gathered and boiled. Bread was mixed with bark flour, acorns, or ground peas to stretch the dough. In some regions, famine bread was baked with powdered roots and dried moss. These weren't rustic dishes. They were desperation made edible. Food shortages weren't always caused by nature. Human systems often failed before the weather did. Lords demanded tithes and rents in grain, even during poor years. Grain speculation in cities led to artificial scarcity. Transport failures turned regional abundance into local disaster. When food disappeared, so did order. Bread riots occurred. Bakers were accused of hoarding. Millers were blamed for fixing weights. In severe years, populations moved. Entire villages left for cities, hoping to trade labor for calories. In cities, communal ovens and church alms gave some relief. But even those had limits. When there was no bread, there was no peace. Yet even during these hardest times, the knowledge of food was preserved. Women knew which plants could be foraged safely. Children learned to trap small animals, collect eggs, gather snails and frogs. Salted fish, hard cheese, dried legumes. These were the durable goods of the medieval diet, stored when times were better. Fermentation extended life. Cabbage became kraut. Milk turned to curds, plums to vinegar. These weren't luxury techniques. They were systems of survival, passed quietly from hand to hand, family to family. The peasant kitchen might have lacked volume, but it never lacked knowledge. In famine years, the church played a complex role. It provided food to the poor, but also taught that hunger was a kind of spiritual trial. Fasting was already part of religious life, and famine blurred the line between devotion and necessity. Some saints were said to have lived on nothing but bread and water. Others miraculously multiplied grain or oil. In monasteries, communal stores were sometimes open to local villagers, though never without tension. Charity was real, but limited. In many cases, religious orders survived better than their surrounding communities, not because of miracles, but because of planning, storage, and consistent access to land. There's a certain quiet dignity in how medieval people approached scarcity. They didn't glamorize it, but neither did they collapse under it. They adapted. They made broth from bones, then turned those bones into tools. They soaked stale bread in milk or ale to make pottages. They turned yesterday's barley into tomorrow's pancakes. They fermented whey into drinks. They used animal blood to enrich porridge, not out of taste, but necessity. Food in times of hardship wasn't just sustenance, it was strategy. Every bite stretched was a victory. Picture now a bowl of black bread, soaked in warm ale, sweetened with the last spoon of honey. A pot of thin soup, bulked with herbs gathered from the woods. A child sharing a boiled turnip with a neighbor. These are the meals history forgets, but they carried the weight of survival. They lacked presentation, but not meaning. The medieval kitchen didn't always have enough, but it never stopped trying. There is resilience in that. To understand how medieval people viewed health, we must begin with balance. Not calories or vitamins, but humors. The body, they believed, was ruled by 4 fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Health came from harmony, sickness from imbalance, and food was one of the primary tools for correction. Each ingredient had a temperament, hot or cold, moist or dry. A chilled, sluggish body might be treated with hot, dry spices. A feverish one with cool, moist vegetables. Meals weren't just cooked, they were prescribed. Herbs were central. Not rare imports, but local, wild, and familiar. Sage was said to strengthen memory. Thyme fought coughs. Mint calmed the stomach. Garlic was a broad protector, believed to purify blood and ward off evil. Fennel helped with digestion. Rue was for melancholy. These herbs were steeped in wine or vinegar, cooked into soups, or dried and ground into pastes. The line between cook and healer blurred. Most households had someone, often a woman, who knew how to brew a fever tea or prepare a poultice. Recipes for these remedies were passed down alongside those for stews and pies. Broth was the default prescription for weakness. Made from bones, herbs, root vegetables, and sometimes a trace of meat, it was believed to restore strength without overburdening the digestion. There were dozens of variations depending on the season and the illness. Broths with leeks and parsley for cough, with barley and fennel for inflammation, with wine and egg yolk for deep fatigue. Soft foods, porridges, custards, almond milk pottages were favored for the sick. Bread soaked in warm milk and honey, or eggs gently poached in herb broth, could be the difference between decline and recovery. Monasteries played a major role in the preservation of this knowledge. Their gardens were medicinal libraries, carefully tended plots of lavender, horehound, hyssop, and more. Monks copied ancient texts from Galen and Dioscorides, blending Roman medical theory with Christian doctrine and local practice. The physic gardens that surrounded cloisters were as essential as the kitchens inside. Healing wasn't rushed. It was seasonal, reflective, a part of daily rhythm. Fasting, too, was sometimes used medicinally, a way to reset the body, to clear imbalance, to make space for spiritual and physical alignment. Not every cure was gentle. Some remedies were aggressive by modern standards. Purgatives, bloodletting, mustard plasters. But food was almost always part of the plan. And when medicine failed, ritual filled the gap. Bread blessed by a priest, water from a holy well, a meal offered in thanks for healing or survival. Healing was a layered process, physical, spiritual, emotional. And meals, no matter how modest, were woven into all three. So picture this now: a bowl of barley broth, thick with sage and soft onions, steaming gently on a windowsill. A small loaf of bread, still warm. A jug of herb-infused wine, not a feast, not a cure-all, but a quiet gesture of care. These were the meals made with patience, with love, with the hope of balance. The medieval kitchen wasn't sterile or clinical. It was alive with intuition, tradition, and small acts of healing. Trade was the quiet revolution of the medieval table. While most people lived local lives, their food told a broader story. Spices from the East, grains from the Mediterranean, preserved goods from the North, all found their way into markets, monasteries, and manor kitchens. Every pinch of cinnamon in a pie, every splash of olive oil in a stew, every raisin folded into bread came from somewhere else. And while only the wealthy could afford them regularly, their influence was far-reaching. Recipes changed, palates shifted, and what once seemed foreign became traditional. The most transformative goods were spices. pepper, ginger, cloves, nutmeg, cinnamon, saffron. Each arrived in small quantities, wrapped tight, expensive as silver. But their effect was dramatic. They preserved meats. They added warmth to grain-based dishes. They balanced sweet and savory. A single clove could lift an entire pot. In the elite kitchens of London, Paris, and Rome, spice blends were closely guarded secrets. But even in modest towns, small amounts found their way in, used sparingly but memorably. A festive pottage, a wedding pie, a holy day biscuit. The spice trade didn't just change taste, it changed status. Beyond spices, other ingredients traveled too. Almonds came from the Mediterranean, ground into milk, pressed into oil, or sweetened for sauces. Sugar, first an elite luxury, gradually became more accessible through North African and Middle Eastern production, reaching Europe via Sicily and the Iberian coast. Rice filtered up through Spain, often used in dishes where grain porridge once dominated. Dried fruits, figs, dates, raisins traveled from vineyards and groves far to the south. These weren't just exotic novelties. They became part of local cuisines, integrated slowly, adjusted to local styles and beliefs. Cultural exchange played as large a role as trade. In Al-Andalus, medieval Islamic Spain, Christian, Muslim, and Jewish communities shared markets, streets, and often recipes. Tagines, couscous, preserved lemons, and spiced lamb dishes left their mark on Iberian foodways. Across the Mediterranean, the Crusades brought not only conquest, but curiosity. Returning soldiers and pilgrims came back with tastes for Eastern food, ideas about preservation, even kitchen techniques. They described chickpeas mashed into paste, flatbreads baked on hot stones, meats marinated in vinegar and herbs. Slowly, some of these ideas took root in European kitchens. Maritime cities became crossroads of culinary innovation. Venice, Genoa, Marseille, ports where goods from the East were unloaded, taxed, and sold. In their kitchens, you'd find fish cooked in wine and spices, nuts ground into sauces, pasta sheets layered with herbs and cheese. These weren't everyday dishes, but they weren't fantasy either. Cookbooks from the period show a gradual blending, northern techniques using southern ingredients, and vice versa. The medieval world may have moved slowly, but it was never still. And still, these global flavors were always adapted to the local rhythm. Imported almonds might be ground into sauce for local fish, raisins folded into rye bread, rice cooked with chicken stock and garden herbs. Even the most exotic dish was touched by place, cooked over local firewood, stirred with local spoons, seasoned with salt mined from nearby cliffs. There was no medieval fusion cuisine, only an evolving conversation between what was known and what was newly discovered. So imagine now a loaf of bread made with northern rye, studded with raisins from Spain, sweetened with a scrape of sugar cone from Alexandria. or a fish stew simmered with garlic, local wine, and a single pinch of imported saffron. Each dish tells a longer story than its ingredients, a story of ships, of markets, of tongues bargaining under tarps and stone archways. The medieval kitchen was more connected than we often think. To sit at the high table in a medieval hall was to see power laid bare. In the great houses of kings, dukes, and bishops, food was carefully curated to reflect rank. The seating, the cutlery, the service, all followed a strict choreography. The Lord's meat came carved by a carver trained not only in slicing but in spectacle. Dishes were announced as they arrived. Servers bowed. Platters shimmered with sauces rarely seen outside court. Almond milk reductions, fruit glazes laced with saffron, custards set with gold leaf. The further one sat from the high table, the simpler the food became. Less meat, fewer sauces, colder servings. Hierarchy wasn't just visible, it was edible. These meals were never private affairs. A royal feast might host hundreds. Tapestries hung from walls. Musicians played between courses. And each dish carried a message. The presence of certain spices, certain animals, swan, for example, or peacock, was intentional. These were not chosen for taste alone. They demonstrated the reach of the ruler's influence. A kitchen that could source cinnamon from Ceylon or sugar from Cyprus was a kitchen that showed its master's global ties. A goose glazed in wine and cloves said more about a baron's wealth than any coin purse. Beyond the castle, food shaped diplomacy. Treaties were sealed over banquets. Marriages brokered across tables. It was common to present rare foods as diplomatic gifts. A barrel of salted sturgeon, a basket of candied oranges, a wheel of aged cheese. These were not just delicacies. They were symbolic offerings. A way of saying, we are rich enough to share. To offer a gift of food was to offer trust, familiarity, even intimacy. To reject it, or serve something inferior in return, could offend deeply. In a time when messages traveled slowly and reputations mattered most, food did the speaking. Ceremonial meals often had rules that blurred into theater. The coronation banquet of a monarch, for example, wasn't just a dinner, it was a ritual. The king's champion might ride into the hall in full armor, throw down a gauntlet, and challenge anyone who disputed the monarch's right. While this happened, diners tore into meat pies shaped like crowns or lions. Dessert might include sugar sculptures of castles, ships, or entire biblical scenes. The food was real, but it was also narrative. It told the story of the ruler's legitimacy, generosity, divinely sanctioned wealth. Even in times of war, meals carried political weight. Field kitchens fed troops by class. Nobles with their own wagons ate dried meat, cheese, and fine bread, while foot soldiers boiled millet or oats in battered pots. Captains might dine publicly to maintain morale. A shared meal before battle, bread, wine, meat, could bind soldiers together in force hierarchy, remind them what they fought for. Sometimes food was used to humiliate starving prisoners given only crusts, or captured nobles forced to eat at the foot of a conqueror's table. The symbolic use of food in conquest was not lost on its participants. It could inspire loyalty or burn memory into a generation. Food was also used to punish. When nobles fell from grace, their meal privileges were the first to be stripped. A duke accused of treason might find his buttery closed, his kitchen dismissed, his daily loaves reduced. For a man raised on roast pheasant and fig sauce, this was a kind of slow execution. For commoners, food punishments were public. Fasting, stocks near market stalls, or the symbolic denial of festival bread. Justice and food intertwined. To be fed or not to be fed was a matter of standing. So imagine this: a hall lit with torches, music echoing in vaulted stone. A dish arrives, a roast boar with apples, glazed and steaming. Eyes follow it as it moves toward the high table. Everyone sees, everyone understands. This is not just meat. It's a message. And just as power used food to command, it also feared hunger. Throughout the medieval period, hunger wasn't just a personal struggle. It was political. When grain failed or taxes soared, when bread prices rose beyond what a common laborer could pay, the people remembered who had kept them fed and who had not. The kitchen, usually a private space of warmth and survival, suddenly spilled into the streets. Markets became battlegrounds. Ovens became symbols. A baker who charged too much or shorted a loaf could find their stall overturned, their goods seized, their house burned. And behind that chaos lay one simple truth: people will starve quietly only for so long. Bread riots were among the most common and feared forms of public disorder in medieval towns. They were spontaneous, driven by hunger, but also by knowledge. People knew what a fair weight looked like. They remembered the last famine. They understood grain laws better than most rulers. When bakers cheated the scales, or when the Lord's granary remained locked while bellies shrank, that knowledge turned into fury. In some cases, the rioters were women, the ones who stood in market lines, who fed families, who knew the price of each crumb. They shouted, they stormed, they demanded loaves. They weren't rebels in the abstract. They were mothers, cooks, laborers with nothing left to trade but defiance. Cities feared these outbursts deeply. Hunger was contagious, and unrest could spread from one village to another by rumor alone. Rulers responded with both violence and gesture. Sometimes grain was released from storehouses, prices forcibly lowered, or festival loaves distributed early. Other times, soldiers arrived, stocks were filled, executions made public, but punishment rarely solved the root. The next bad harvest would test the peace again. In England, France, the German states, it was always the same pattern: years of pressure, then a spark. And often, Food was that spark. Larger uprisings often formed around food, but evolved into broader demands. In 1381, the Peasants' Revolt in England began not with bread, but with taxes, yet hunger played a central role. Poor harvests had weakened villages. The Black Death had left labor scarce, and food production unstable. When the state pressed harder, the people pushed back. Marches began, manors were attacked. In some towns, bakers and millers were spared only if they were known to be fair. The revolt was crushed, but the memory remained. Hunger could unify as surely as any cause. Even outside of open revolt, food remained a point of tension between rulers and the ruled. Lords were expected to offer hospitality, particularly during crisis. A noble who fed his people during famine earned loyalty that no tax collector could buy. But one who hoarded grain or exported food while his tenants starved risked not only rebellion but legacy. Chronicles remember both the generous and the cruel. A feast given in lean times might be recorded in song. A theft of grain might be remembered for generations. In the countryside, some resistance took quieter forms, foraging on private lands, hunting illegally, poaching fish from the Lord's stream. These acts, though minor, were statements. We will not starve quietly. The forest became a second pantry, and laws about what could be taken and by whom only fed the resentment. A rabbit snared in secret. A few stalks of grain gleaned from a harvested field. These were not crimes of greed. They were acts of survival. Now imagine this. A crowd gathered at the town square, the baker's cart overturned, flour dust rising like smoke. A woman lifts a broken loaf, too light, too hard, too expensive, and hurls it at the manor gates. There's no feast tonight, just fire, just voices raised not in song, but demand. The medieval world may seem distant, but this hunger for fairness, for food, for dignity is eternal. Monastic life reordered everything, including how one ate. In a world ruled by hunger and hierarchy, the monastery offered something different: structure, routine, quiet. Food was part of this design. Monks and nuns followed strict schedules, and meals were no exception. The rule of Saint Benedict, the foundation of many monastic orders, prescribed moderation, communal eating, and a limited diet. It wasn't about denial. It was about balance. In theory, meals nourished but did not distract. In practice, they revealed a world of discipline and grace. Silence often governed the monastic table. Meals were taken in refectories, long stone-walled halls, where the only sounds were the soft clatter of bowls and the voice of a reader, usually reciting scripture or hagiographies. Eating was not social. It was sacred. Monks sat in assigned places, served each other in order, and ate what was given without complaint. There were no second helpings, no preferences voiced. To fuss over food was to display ego, and ego was the enemy of spiritual progress. Meat was typically restricted, especially the flesh of four-legged animals. Many orders allowed only fish, eggs, dairy, and plant-based foods. On fasting days, even these might be limited further. But again, this wasn't starvation. It was ritual. Meals were built around legumes, bread, root vegetables, and whatever the monastic gardens could provide. Onions, leeks, cabbage, garlic. Herbs grown for both flavor and healing, sage, thyme, hyssop, marjoram. Cheese made from goat's milk. Bread baked fresh in the monastery oven, coarse but filling. Water, sometimes wine, never excess. The gardens were more than practical. They were spiritual places. Monks believed that tending to plants, growing food with their own hands, brought them closer to God. They tracked the sun, the moon, the rain. They learned which plants healed and which harmed. They preserved food not for luxury, but to sustain the body during long winters and longer vigils. Drying herbs, salting fish, aging cheese, these were quiet acts of preparation, of service. They mirrored the internal preparation for prayer and contemplation. Feasting did exist within monastic walls, but only at specific times. On great feast days, Easter, Christmas, certain saint days, the rule loosened. A better wine, a richer dish, a sweet bread baked with dried fruit and honey. These were not indulgences, but celebrations of the liturgical year, joy made edible. And always the rhythm returned. The fasting days, the simple stews, the lentil pottages. Food wasn't about craving or novelty. It was about rhythm, gratitude, surrender. What emerged from these practices wasn't a cuisine of complexity, but one of clarity. A bowl of barley with wild garlic, a slice of rye bread with soft cheese, a pear peeled and shared. These meals nourished more than just the body. They taught restraint, reverence, presence. In the silence of the monastery, food became something close to liturgy, a daily ritual that asked not for more, but for enough. Picture now a long wooden table in a cool stone room. The light is low. A line of monks sit shoulder to shoulder, robes brushing. A single bell rings. Heads bow. Bread is broken. No one speaks. There's no salt-crusted roast. No glistening pie. Just a bowl of soup, a crust of bread, a jug of water, and yet nothing is missing. In a time before passports, dialects, and diets defined identity, to taste someone's food was to taste where they came from, the soil beneath their feet, the weather that shaped their harvests, the traditions passed down without ink, the grain in your bread, the oil in your stew, even the herbs in your broth revealed your region. Northern France leaned on butter and cream. Southern France cooked in oil and wine. Germanic lands used lard. Mediterranean coasts thrived on olive oil and almonds. You could taste latitude. Across England, the differences were just as distinct. In the north, barley and oats dominated. In the south, more wheat. Inland, salted pork. and root vegetables. On the coast, fish stews and preserved herring. The Welsh had caul, a meat and leek soup. The Scots, oatcakes and broths. The English Midlands, pies, dense breads, and strong cheeses. Even the spices favored changed by region. Geography was taste. And so food became a quiet kind of boundary, shared within communities, eyed with suspicion from outside. Faith further deepened these divides. Christians, Muslims, and Jews often lived in close proximity, especially in cities and trade hubs. But their food laws diverged sharply. Pork, forbidden in Islam and Judaism, was common in Christian lands. Wine, sacred in Christianity, prohibited in Islam. Jewish kitchens followed kashrut, dietary laws that shaped not only what was eaten, but how it was prepared. These differences were more than custom. They were visible markers. The butcher you bought from, the day you baked bread, the spices you used. To share a meal was to extend trust. To decline could carry insult. And yet exchange still happened, slowly, naturally, and often through women. A Jewish housekeeper in a Christian home. A Muslim merchant dining in a Spanish inn. Recipes crossed walls and borders before words did. The almond milk of Muslim Iberia found its way into Christian monastic cookbooks. The spice blends of Jewish cooks flavored Andalusian sweets. These moments of culinary crossover weren't always recorded, but they happened in kitchens, over shared fire through taste rather than treaty. Among peasants, food was less about ideology and more about survival. But even here, regional pride held firm. A cheese might only be made in one valley. A method of brewing ale might be guarded for generations. Certain dishes were reserved for holy days, not out of doctrine, but tradition. A particular stew for Candlemas. A specific loaf for All Saints. These patterns held memory. They marked the seasons, the stories, the ancestors. To eat the wrong bread on the wrong day felt off, like forgetting a name. Migration, when it happened, stirred the pot. Travelers brought recipes. Soldiers brought new tastes. Monks transplanted vines and grains. Even crusaders, returning from foreign campaigns, brought back flavors, not always understanding them, but craving them. Some of these new foods took hold. Others didn't. The ones that stayed were those that adapted, softened, blended into existing customs. No medieval cuisine was pure. All were evolving, slowly, locally, meaningfully. Imagine now a table set in a Tuscan village. Olive oil, garlic, chickpeas, rosemary, flavors unmistakably southern. Contrast it with a table in northern England. Dark bread, cabbage soup, salt pork, ale. Neither is better. Both are honest. Both reflect the earth, the air, the habits of centuries. To eat one is to know something that cannot be written, only lived. Most medieval kitchens weren't rooms, they were zones, parts of houses, lean tos, outdoor hearths, outbuildings set apart to protect the main living quarters from fire and smoke. In castles and manor houses, they might be grander. Vaulted stone rooms with wide fireplaces, storerooms, and adjacent pantries. But even these were built around one thing: the fire, not a stove, not an oven dial, an open flame. The medieval kitchen was ruled by heat, and mastery meant knowing how to command it with nothing but ash, wood, and air. Cooking vessels reflected this reality. Pots were made from heavy iron or thick ceramic. They hung over the fire from chains or sat on tripods nestled among coals. Griddles were flat and placed directly in embers. Clay baking domes, called cloches, could be heated separately and placed over dough. There were no clocks to time a stew, no thermometers to check doneness. The cook listened, watched, smelled. A shifting bubble pattern in a pot meant it was close. A change in scent told when onions were ready. Skill was a matter of sensory memory. Utensils were minimal, durable, and often handmade. Wooden spoons, iron knives, mortars and pestles, long-handled ladles, bread paddles for sliding loaves into hot ovens, skimmers woven from twigs. No item was disposable. Each was cared for, passed down, sometimes buried with the dead. And then there were the stone tools, querns for grinding grain by hand. These required hours of work, shoulders and arms pushing rhythmically. The sound of a quern, a slow, gritty churn, was part of the kitchen's music. Storage was another discipline. With no refrigeration, food preservation was a full-time task. Meat was salted, hung, smoked. Grains were kept dry in sacks or jars sealed with wax. Vegetables were stored in root cellars buried in sand or straw. Jars lined shelves, filled with pickled greens, dried beans, preserved fruits. The pantry was not a luxury. It was a defense. A record of labor already done. Each item stored was a promise that hunger could be held off for a while longer. Even the layout of the kitchen reflected purpose. In a wealthier home, there might be separate rooms, one for baking, one for boiling, one for cold storage. A larder, a buttery, a scullery. These divisions made sense not just by function, but by heat. The bakery with its hot oven needed airflow. The larder, for storing perishables, needed to stay cool and dark. In peasant homes, the entire kitchen might be a corner of the one-room house, a fire pit, a hook, a stool. But no matter the scale, the logic was there. A place for drying herbs, a space to cure meat, a surface for kneading dough, and always at the center of it all, hands, skilled, blistered, practiced hands, cooks who could lift a cauldron with one arm, skim fat with 2 fingers, adjust flame with a twist of coal. They didn't measure in teaspoons or grams. They used their palms, their eyes, their memory. They carried generations of habit in their gestures. A grandmother's way of tying herbs, a father's rhythm with a blade, a sister's instinct for when the bread was ready. These were not recipes, they were traditions. Now picture this: a dim room lit by firelight, a stew bubbling in a wide pot, steam rising, thick with the smell of leeks and barley, a wooden board dusted with flour, a hand smoothing dough, a bundle of sage hanging near the rafters, a dog curled under the bench. This was the medieval kitchen. It wasn't spotless, it wasn't quiet, but it worked. It fed, it healed, it remembered. The table in the medieval world was rarely just furniture. It was a space of rhythm, repetition, necessity, sometimes a plank on trestles, sometimes stone built into the wall, sometimes nothing more than a flat lap and a bowl. But wherever it stood, it brought people together. Families, workers, guests. A meal wasn't a performance here. It was an act of survival, of habit, of quiet community. You didn't eat alone if you could help it. Food was meant to be shared, and the table was where that sharing became real. There were no courses for most. Everything was served at once: soup, bread, cheese, a slice of meat if fortune allowed. The bread might be torn, not cut. A pottage might be passed from hand to hand. Children learned early to dip, to chew, to wait. Elders took first. Guests were served in order of rank. Everyone knew the order, even when no one said it. Etiquette wasn't formal, but it was firm. Don't take more than you need. Don't speak with your mouth full. Don't insult the food. You never knew when it would run out. The table told the story of a household. If it was full, that meant the season had been kind, or someone had hunted well or traded wisely. If it was sparse, no one complained. They just stretched it thinner. A little more broth. A second round of bread toasted hard and soaked in ale. In the better months, when gardens gave freely, the table was green and sweet. Peas, onions, herbs, strawberries, gooseberries, lettuce. In winter, it was brown, beige, boiled, roots, cured meats, heavy loaves. It changed with the earth. Prayer marked the start of most meals. In Christian households, grace was spoken, often short, often quiet, but always there. It set the tone. In monasteries, prayer framed every bite. In Jewish homes, blessings were said before and after, linking food to ritual. Even among the less devout, there was usually a pause, a breath, a moment of thanks. Because food wasn't assumed. It was earned, grown, fought for, preserved against rain and rats. Every meal was the product of hundreds of hidden acts. And then there was what came after, not dessert, but conversation. Children helping clear bowls, someone refilling a mug, a story told, a joke remembered, the clink of knives being cleaned. These were the soft edges of daily life. The table wasn't just where food ended, it was where the evening began, where people sat a little longer than they needed to. where silence didn't mean discomfort, only peace. There is something sacred in that. Not dramatic, not grand, just sacred. Now, as we end this journey, sit for a moment in that quiet. Imagine the room. Fire dimming, bowls empty, bread torn down to crumbs. You are full, not bursting, just full enough. The food was humble, but it had weight. History, hands, thought. That was the gift of the medieval kitchen. It never rushed. It respected the slow, the seasonal, the shared. The best food in history wasn't built on excess. It was built on intention. And now that you've tasted it, across villages, monasteries, feast halls, and famine years, you'll carry it with you. Because food always leaves something behind.